Atlanta is a city of heat and life, full of noise and movement that is hard to ignore. But that's only during the day. At night, it becomes something else. Quiet, still, almost too peaceful, as if the atmosphere itself changes the moment the sun dips below the horizon. My life has always been ordinary, perhaps too ordinary. Work, home, work again. Nothing special, just the mundane rhythm most people would call a normal existence. But that all changed last month when I first heard about the tram. It's an old streetcar, they say, but not one you'd find on any official route or map. The strange thing is that this tram only runs at night, and only when the city is at its quietest. The first time I heard about it was through my coworker, Mike. He was always full of odd stories and urban legends, but this one caught my attention more than usual. It wasn't the kind of ghost story you'd hear around a campfire, but something deeper, something unsettling. The Midnight Tram, he had called it with a smirk. It's just a story, of course, but people say that if you see it, you'll never come back the same. Some don't come back at all. I brushed it off as another of Mike's weird tales. Yet, for the next few nights, I couldn't shake the thought. Something about it gnawed at the back of my mind, creeping into my dreams, making me wake up drenched in sweat. The idea of a tram that roams the empty streets while the world sleeps. It was absurd, but there was a part of me that felt drawn to it, an inexplicable curiosity that kept pulling me closer. Then, one night, everything changed. I was working late, trying to finish up a project that was due the next morning. By the time I finally left the office, the streets were nearly deserted. The city, usually so alive, felt hollow. I couldn't help but notice how empty the roads were. Not even the usual hum of distant traffic. Just silence. It was then I heard it, the faint ringing of a tram bell. At first, I thought I imagined it. It was so distant, so subtle, like a memory of a sound rather than the real thing. But it came again, clearer this time, the unmistakable chime of an old streetcar. I stopped walking and looked around. The street was completely empty, only the dim glow of streetlights stretching down the block. There was no tram in sight, yet the sound persisted, getting closer, as if something was slowly approaching from just beyond the corner. Against my better judgment, I stayed rooted in place, waiting. My heart began to race, an odd mixture of fear and anticipation building inside me. Then, from the shadows at the far end of the street, it emerged, a tram. It was old, older than any I'd ever seen. The green and cream paint was chipped, and the windows were so dirty they were almost opaque. The headlights flickered weakly, barely illuminating the road ahead. But it was the passengers that made my stomach twist. They were shadows, or at least that's what they looked like. Dark, indistinct figures sitting in the seats, their faces turned towards the windows, but completely expressionless. I couldn't tell if they were people or just illusions created by the dim light, but the sight of them made my skin crawl. The tram rolled past me slowly, the wheels grinding against the tracks with a sound that set my teeth on edge. I should have walked away. I should have turned back and headed home. But instead, I found myself stepping towards the tram, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. As I got closer, the doors creaked open. A cold gust of wind swept past me, sending a shiver down my spine. Inside, the shadows seemed to shift, as if they were waiting for me. Without thinking, I stepped inside. The doors slammed shut behind me with a finality that made my heart leap into my throat. I was inside the tram now, and everything outside seemed to fade away, swallowed by the night. The interior was dim, the only light coming from a flickering bulb near the ceiling. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every breath I took. I moved down the aisle, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. The passengers, those dark, faceless figures, remained still, their heads turning ever so slightly as I passed by. I tried to avoid looking directly at them, afraid of what I might see if I did. There was no conductor, no driver. The tram seemed to move of its own accord, gliding through the empty streets as if it had a mind of its own. I had no idea where it was taking me, and yet I couldn't bring myself to try and get off. It felt as though I was trapped, bound to this strange journey through the heart of the night. The city outside the windows no longer looked familiar. It was distorted, twisted into shapes and shadows that didn't make sense. Buildings stretched unnaturally tall, streets curved where they shouldn't, and the lights were wrong. They flickered, not like faulty bulbs, but as if they were alive, pulsing with a heartbeat all their own. I don't know how long I stayed on that tram. Time felt different inside, slower, distorted, like I was moving through a dream. The only constant was the dull ringing of the tram bell and the quiet hum of the wheels on the tracks. Finally, after what felt like hours, the tram slowed to a stop. The doors creaked open again, and I was greeted by a street I didn't recognize. It was empty, desolate, not a single soul in sight. The buildings here were crumbling, covered in vines and rot, like they had been abandoned for decades. The air smelled of mildew and decay. I stepped off the tram, my legs shaky, my mind racing with questions. Where was I? What had just happened? As I turned back to look at the tram, it was gone, disappeared into the night as if it had never existed. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, and I knew that I would never be the same again. The street I stepped onto felt wrong. It was more than the decay, more than the lifeless air that hung heavy around me. There was an unnatural stillness, like the city itself had ceased to breathe. The buildings leaned at odd angles, their windows shattered and dark, gaping like open mouths ready to swallow me whole. I stood frozen for a moment, my legs stiff from the tram ride, my mind struggling to process where I had ended up. But the truth was inescapable. I didn't recognize anything around me. I reached into my pocket for my phone, thinking I could at least pull up a map, call a ride, something. But the screen was dead. No power, no signal. It was like I'd stepped out of time, or maybe out of reality itself. As I slipped the useless device back into my pocket, a deep chill spread through my chest. There was no going back. The tram was gone. Turning in slow circles, I tried to make sense of the surroundings. The street was unfamiliar, yes, but it wasn't completely deserted. There were signs of life, decayed, ghostly remnants of it. An old cafe sat on the corner, its windows covered in grime, a faded closed sign hanging crookedly on the door. Across from it, what looked like a park, though the trees were skeletal, their branches bare and twisted like the bones of some long-dead creature. But the most disturbing thing was the silence. Not a single sound. No wind. No distant hum of city life. Not even the echo of my own footsteps. It was as if the world around me had been muted. Despite the creeping fear curling in my stomach, I forced myself to move forward. Standing still felt like surrendering to the darkness pressing in from all sides. My footsteps were heavy, unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. I walked past a row of boarded-up shops, the wood brittle and splintered as if it had been there for decades, though something told me that was impossible. The further I went, the more the world around me seemed to warp. The buildings loomed taller, the streetlights above flickered erratically, casting shadows that danced unnervingly out of sync with my movements. My sense of direction began to slip. Each turn I took brought me deeper into this twisted version of the city, and soon I couldn't even tell which way I had come from. It wasn't until I saw the figure that the true weight of my isolation hit me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow flickering in the distance, just beyond the reach of the dim street lamp. But as I squinted through the gloom, I realized it wasn't just my imagination. Someone or something was standing there motionless at the far end of the street. I stopped walking, my heart skipping a beat. "Hello," I called out, the word sounding thin and hollow in the stillness. The figure didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, squinting to make out any details. It was too far away to see clearly, just a silhouette framed against the decaying buildings. Tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs stretched thin, almost elongated. My throat tightened as I realized it wasn't facing me. It was facing the tram tracks, standing eerily still, as though waiting for something. The tram. The thought jolted through me like ice water down my spine. What if this figure was connected to the tram? What if it was waiting for me? My mind raced, desperately searching for a rational explanation, but nothing about this situation was rational. I backed away, hoping that if I moved quietly enough, it wouldn't notice me. But with each step I took, the figure seemed to grow taller, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the ground, crawling towards me like a living thing. And then it turned. My heart froze in my chest as the figure slowly, impossibly, swiveled its head to face me. Even from a distance, I could feel its eyes, though I couldn't see them, boring into me cold and unblinking. It took a step forward, the movement jerky and wrong, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the cracked pavement, the world around me spinning in a blur of shadows and flickering light. My breath came in ragged gasps, the silence of the city now broken by the sound of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. Feel that thing behind me, its presence growing closer, like a chill crawling up my spine. I darted down an alleyway, hoping to lose it, but the narrow path only seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The walls around me closed in, the buildings leaning over as if they were watching, waiting. The alley seemed to pulse, the shadows alive with a malevolent energy that pressed in from all sides. Suddenly, I burst out onto another street, skidding to a halt. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were made of lead, but the figure was nowhere in sight. I doubled over, gasping for air, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. For a moment I thought I had escaped, but when I straightened up, I saw it. The tram. It was there again, parked in the middle of the street, its doors open wide, waiting for me like a hungry mouth. But this time, the inside wasn't empty. Through the filthy windows, I could see the passengers, those shadowy figures, turning their heads in unison, their blank faces all staring directly at me. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I sprinted in the opposite direction, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that cursed tram. But no matter how fast I ran, how many turns I took, the tram was always there, waiting for me. At every corner, every intersection, it appeared, relentless in its pursuit. The air grew colder, the buildings around me more decrepit, as though the city itself was decaying the longer I stayed here. My vision blurred, sweat pouring down my face, but I couldn't stop. I knew if I did, if I let that tram catch me again, I wouldn't be able to escape a second time. Finally, in one last desperate burst of energy, I found myself stumbling into what looked like an old train yard. Rusted tracks crisscrossed the ground, leading nowhere, disappearing into piles of debris and overgrown weeds. The sky above was dark, no stars, no moon, just an endless, suffocating blackness. I collapsed onto the ground, my chest heaving, every muscle in my body screaming in exhaustion. I listened for the tram, for the grinding of its wheels or the ominous toll of its bell, but there was only silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, the city was still. But as I lay there, staring up into the abyss above, I realized something was terribly wrong. The ground beneath me, it wasn't solid. It was soft, shifting, as though the earth itself was breathing. And then I felt it. A hand. Cold, clammy fingers wrapped around my ankle, pulling me down into the darkness. The fingers that wrapped around my ankle were ice cold, their touch sending a shockwave of terror through my body. I jerked my leg, trying to free myself, but the grip tightened, pulling me down into the soft, shifting ground beneath me. The more I struggled, the deeper I sank, the earth swallowing me inch by inch. I clawed at the ground, desperately trying to find something solid to hold on to, but the dirt crumbled away in my hands like dust. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I sank deeper, the cold hand dragging me down with an unnatural strength. A low, guttural whisper rose from beneath me, the words incomprehensible but filled with malice. Then, as suddenly as it had grabbed me, the hand let go. I lay there, gasping for breath, half buried in the ground. The weight of the earth pressed down on my legs, but I managed to pull myself free, trembling as I scrambled to my feet. My heart was racing, my entire body shaking with fear and exhaustion. I looked around, expecting to see the source of the hand, but there was nothing. Just the empty, decaying train yard stretching out in all directions. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, as if the city itself had paused, watching me, waiting for my next move. But something was different now. The air felt thicker, heavier, and there was a faint sound in the distance. A low rumble like a machine waking up. I knew what it was before I even turned around. The tram was back. It sat there, just beyond the train yard, half shrouded in shadow. Its headlights flickered weakly, casting long, distorted beams of light that seemed to bend and twist unnaturally. The doors were open again, that dark, gaping maw inviting me inside. But this time, the tram wasn't empty. The passengers, the shadowy figures, were standing just inside the doorway, their faceless heads turned towards me. They didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel them watching, waiting for me to make a choice. I staggered back, my mind racing with a single, desperate thought. I needed to get out of here. I needed to wake up from this nightmare. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a dream. The tram was real, this place was real, and whatever was happening to me, whatever had pulled me into this nightmare, was far from over. I turned and ran again, my legs burning with exhaustion, my lungs screaming for air. The city around me seemed to shift and warp as I moved, the buildings bending at impossible angles, the streets twisting and stretching in ways that defied logic. The train yard dissolved into an alley, the alley into another unfamiliar street. I had no idea where I was going. There was no destination, no escape route, just the primal instinct to run, to flee from the tram and the horrors that came with it. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't outrun the tram. I could hear it now, the low grinding of its wheels on the tracks, the soft toll of its bell echoing through the empty streets. It was following me, relentlessly, its presence growing closer with every step. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw it. Closer than before, the passengers inside still staring, still waiting. My mind screamed at me to keep running, but my body was reaching its limit. My legs felt like lead, my chest burning with each breath. I couldn't keep going much longer. I needed a plan, some way to hide, to lose it. But every turn I took brought me back to the same place. The tram was always there, waiting, as if the city itself was conspiring against me. Then I saw it. A building that stood out among the decayed ruins, its facade surprisingly intact. It was an old theater, its marquee hanging crookedly above the entrance. The words faded and unreadable. But the doors were open, a faint light spilling out into the street. Without thinking, I darted inside. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the lingering scent of mildew. The theater was massive, its high ceilings lost in shadows, the rows of seats stretching out into the darkness. A single, dim light flickered on the stage, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist as I moved deeper into the building. I crouched down behind a row of seats, my body trembling with exhaustion, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I was safe, that the tram couldn't follow me here. But even as I tried to catch my breath, a creeping dread settled over me. The silence was too deep, too unnatural. And then I heard it, the faint toll of the tram's bell, muffled but unmistakable. It was still out there, still searching for me. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would pass by, that it wouldn't find me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. The tram wasn't just following me. It was hunting me. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, it was impossible to tell. Time had lost all meaning in this place. The tram bell had fallen silent again, but the tension in the air remained, thick and suffocating. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Then, from the far end of the theater, I heard something move. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like feet dragging across the floor. My heart leapt into my throat, and I held my breath, straining to hear where it was coming from. The darkness was so thick, I could barely see beyond the row of seats in front of me. The sound grew louder, closer. I peeked over the top of the seat and froze. There, at the edge of the stage, was a figure. It stood motionless, shrouded in shadow, its head tilted slightly to the side as if listening. It wasn't one of the passengers from the tram. It was something else, something darker. Its body was thin, emaciated, the skin stretched tight over bones. But its face, it didn't have one. Just a smooth, featureless surface where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. And it was moving towards me. I ducked back behind the seat, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. I was trapped. The figure was between me and the exit, and there was no other way out. The shuffling sound grew louder, and I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping, praying that it would pass me by. But then the sound stopped. It was right behind me. I felt the air grow colder, the weight of its presence pressing down on me. I didn't move, didn't breathe, every muscle in my body locked in terror. The figure stood there, just inches away, its breath cold and wet against the back of my neck. Slowly, so slowly it was agonizing, I turned my head. It was gone. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. 1 second it had been there, standing over me, and the next, it had vanished into the shadows. But the fear didn't leave me. If anything, it grew stronger, because I knew whatever that thing was, it hadn't left. It was still here, somewhere in the darkness, watching me, waiting. I stood up, my legs shaking, and started towards the exit, keeping my eyes on the stage, on the shadows that seemed to pulse and shift with every step I took. I needed to get out of here, now. But as I reached the door, I heard it again. The tram bell, louder this time, closer. I stepped outside and froze. The tram was waiting for me, its headlights flickering, the doors open wide. And this time I couldn't resist. I stepped inside. The moment I stepped back onto the tram, I knew there was no going back. The doors slammed shut behind me, sealing me inside with a final, echoing clang that sent a shiver down my spine. The air was thick with that same oppressive silence, and the passengers, those shadowy, faceless figures, sat motionless, their heads turned towards me in eerie unison. I didn't sit down. My legs felt too weak, my body too numb to move, but I couldn't bring myself to take a seat among them. Instead, I stood in the aisle, gripping the metal pole next to me as the tram jerked into motion. Outside the windows, the city blurred by in a haze of darkness and distortion, the world outside twisting and warping in ways that defied explanation. I glanced around, searching for some kind of sign, something to tell me where this tram was taking me. But there was nothing, no conductor, no map, no announcement of the next stop. Just the steady, rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks and the low, distant hum of the engine. The other passengers remained eerily still, their blank, shadowy faces turned towards the windows as if they were staring into some unseen void. I could feel their presence, though heavy and suffocating, like they were aware of me, watching me even when they didn't move. My pulse pounded in my ears, the fear clawing its way up my throat as I realized that I wasn't alone on this tram. But I wasn't sure if these figures were even alive. I was caught in some kind of limbo, trapped in a nightmarish journey through a version of the city that no longer made sense. The lights outside flickered, and I could barely make out the streets, twisted, unfamiliar, and growing more alien with each passing second. Buildings loomed like skeletal remains, leaning over the tram as if they might collapse and swallow it whole. As the tram sped onward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just a passenger. No, I was being taken somewhere far worse than any place I had ever imagined. The deeper the tram carried me into the night, the more I felt the weight of that realization settle in. This wasn't a ride with an end. It was a descent. Suddenly, the tram jolted violently, nearly throwing me off my feet. I gripped the pole tighter, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to steady myself. The flickering lights above me dimmed further, casting long shadows across the tram's interior. I looked towards the front of the car, where the driver's compartment should have been, but there was nothing, just darkness. The tram was moving faster now, the sound of the wheels on the tracks growing louder, more frantic. I stumbled forward, drawn towards the front, needing to understand what was happening. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the silence, as if the tram were amplifying every sound I made. When I reached the front, I stopped, There was no driver, no controls, just a smooth, featureless wall of metal where the operator should have been. My reflection stared back at me from the polished surface, pale and wide-eyed, my face twisted in confusion and fear. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't right. I stepped closer, my breath fogging up the glass as I peered into the mirror-like surface. My reflection, it wasn't mimicking my movements. It stood there, still, watching me with eyes that were darker than they should have been, as though the shadows behind me were seeping into the image itself. And then it smiled. A slow, unnatural grin spread across the reflection's face, stretching far too wide, the corners of its mouth twisting up in a grotesque imitation of a human expression. I staggered back, heart racing, but the reflection remained in place, smiling at me, its eyes growing darker and darker until they were nothing but two black holes. I turned away, unable to look at it any longer, but the moment I did, the lights in the tram flickered again, plunging the entire car into darkness. I froze. There was no sound, no movement, just the oppressive blackness pressing down on me from all sides. I could feel the weight of the passengers' gazes on me, even though I couldn't see them. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, of being surrounded by things that weren't quite human. The tram rumbled beneath my feet, the vibrations growing stronger, more erratic. I could hear something now, something beneath the noise of the wheels and the hum of the engine. A low, guttural whisper, like voices murmuring just out of reach, rising and falling in a language I couldn't understand. And then, from the darkness, a hand touched my shoulder. I spun around, my heart slamming into my chest, but there was nothing there. Just the empty aisle, the seats filled with shadowy figures who hadn't moved an inch. But I knew what I had felt. Something had touched me. Something cold, clammy, like the hand that had grabbed me in the train yard. A faint light flickered to life at the far end of the tram, casting long shadows across the floor. The passengers, still unmoving, seemed to fade into the background, their forms growing even more indistinct in the dim glow. But something else was there now, something standing in the doorway at the far end of the car. It was the same figure I had seen in the theater, the one with no face. My breath caught in my throat as it stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as though it were savoring every moment. The air grew colder with each step it took, a heavy, suffocating chill that pressed down on me like a weight. Couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as it came closer and closer. When it reached the middle of the tram, it stopped. For a moment, it stood there, its head tilted to the side, as if listening. Then, without warning, it turned its faceless head towards me. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape, to tear open the doors and throw myself off the tram, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure took another step, and I could feel its presence, heavy and cold, wrapping around me like a shroud. It was so close now, close enough to touch. The tram screeched to a halt. The doors hissed open behind me, and for a moment, I thought I was free. I thought that maybe, just maybe, I could escape this nightmare. But when I turned to look, the street outside wasn't the city I knew. It was something else entirely. A vast, empty landscape stretched out before me, bathed in a sickly, pale light. The ground was cracked and broken, like the surface of some alien world, and the sky above was a swirling mass of black clouds, roiling and twisting as if alive. In the distance, I could see something moving, figures, hundreds of them, walking slowly across the barren wasteland. The faceless figure was standing at the edge of the tram's doorway now, its head still tilted, waiting for me to step off, to join the others. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, but the tram's interior had changed. The walls were closing in, the seats shrinking, the shadows creeping closer. I could feel the cold breath of the other passengers on my skin, their eyes, if they had any, burning into me from the darkness. There was no escape. With trembling hands, I turned back towards the doorway. The faceless figure didn't move, didn't speak, simply waited, patient and still. And in that moment, I knew this was the last stop. I stepped off the tram,